Welcome to Listen and Learn with Jay and Kay, where we challenge the status quo and add to what we know. I'm Jay.
And I'm Kay. Hi, Jay.
Hi, Kay.
You feeling all right?
Yeah, not the best, but I think we'll get through a conversation. Hopefully, a handy conversation, actually.
Oh, it probably will be because you know what's been on my mind?
What's that?
It's a common word. It's in everybody's vocabulary in North America. But I've been thinking about dominance. And I just think that rings a whole different set of bells when you say dominance to a therapist. Do you?
I do. I think the most common, of course, is handedness. Right hand
Yes.
dominance, left hand dominance, but
Yes.
I think there are also dominance in the legs, which we probably don't think about as much, or even other parts of the body.
Sure. You even have a dominant eye. Did you know that?
I did know that. I actually think you have a dominant ear. I think when people turn their head to listen
Yes, I
in.
think you're right. You're right. And you know, my sister's a dentist, and she tells me there's dominance on a chewing side.
Really? I believe that. I think I tend to
Yeah,
chew more on one side than the other.
yeah. I think everybody does. But anyway, my struggle lately has been with patients who, I mean, it's a problem whether the dominant side is affected or the non-dominant side is affected.
Mm,
Because if you're lucky enough to have your stroke spare your dominant hand, that's a really good thing, right? Because it's the most skilled hand, and everybody feels lucky. Then I mean, I've heard my patients say, well, at least I still have my right hand if they're right handed.
that may be true, but from a therapist standpoint, that may be unlucky because once the dominant side is available, it will monopolize all opportunities for use. And so, as a therapist, sometimes I think that when it's the non-dominant that's spared and the affected side's the dominant, if we can get some function and movement in that arm or in that hand, I find they'll at least then try to use it more.
Yeah, but you know what we do as therapists sometimes is that we just say, oh, well, sorry, your right hand doesn't work anymore. You can learn to write with your left hand. I mean, we
Right.
just sort of impose a switched dominance on people unless you're a neuropro therapist, of course, and you're keen to the fact that it's, as you're saying, an opportunity for the more dominant hand to really need to come to life.
As you say that, I think the other mistake that I've made, or other therapists I'm sure have made in the past, is that when it's the non dominant side, especially for hands, we sometimes struggle to think of how best to incorporate that into tasks since so many are driven by a dominant hand that we then want them to practice therapy of the non dominant hand by doing dominant hand tasks. And that's a
Yes,
mismatch too.
I know. I mean, I find myself doing that. I have a great patient who's really got a high functioning hand, and it's his non-dominant hand. And you think of things like, well, maybe the non-dominant hand and arm are really good for support. Well,
Right.
they are in the early days. That's a really good way to start. But now he's playing golf and driving a car and doing everything. So now what's the way to challenge his hand? So now I find myself in the situation of needing to give him tasks that require a lot more specific kind of function, like it would be true of his right hand, his dominant hand. And sometimes he even says to me, well, I would really do this with my right hand. And I say, well, yeah, I know, but really, for me, the gold standard is still to see if I can get the left hand to look like the right hand, to match the performance. So, for instance, he's a card player, and sometimes I have him just turn over cards off the top of a deck.
Right.
And so we can set a kind of a standard for him by having him do it with his dominant
Mm-hmm.
hand. And then we see how far off he is with his left,
Right.
because something he told me about himself is that he deals left-handed, even though he's a
Interesting.
right-handed card player. So, yeah, so you can. There are some things that we switch handedness on, and that's just lucky that I kind of came upon that one. But yeah, I mean, that's really tough when you are looking at using just one hand and then requiring something of the non-dominant hand that they would never choose to do with that hand.
Well, and I think you just alluded to another idea is that with one of my patients, I really think about occupying that dominant hand. So I
Mm-hmm.
have to, if I want to work on a unimanual task with the non dominant side, I need to give a job to the dominant hand. So
Yeah,
if that hand is occupied or busy, even though you might preferentially choose to use your dominant hand if it were available, if it is not available, then they can choose to use the other hand. Um, and so that's a way to, force the function of that non-dominant side, because although they would say, I would choose the other hand, it's not an option right now. Or
yeah,
perhaps other times, what I've done with some of my other clients is then think about, like you were saying, that matching, whether they do a bimanual task where they both push or they both squeeze or they both carry and they see that symmetry and that benchmarking, like you mentioned,
yeah.
or actually it's the opposite, a push pull or a rotation counter rotation, like opening something where it would have to counter the force and rise to the challenge of the dominant side.
Yeah, that opening is a really interesting thing because I think the literature says that there's always a dominant hand for every
Mm,
task, even for ones that look symmetrical. But let's say you're opening a jar of peanut butter. Really? I mean, I have seen patients so often abandon holding with their maybe more involved hand because they see this screwing the top as the harder task. So they think, okay, well, I'll just hold the bottom. And then the whole thing just spins around in
that's
their
right.
hand that's trying to hold. And then they end up with the thing between their knees, holding
Exactly.
it between their knees.
Yep, just squeeze it.
Yeah, yeah. So, but and really, when I use bimanual task, I think the challenge there is finding a task that really requires two hands to do it because our patients
Right.
get very adept at performance with one hand. I mean, I just can't believe how clever they are. And so when you think, oh, well, they'll have to use two hands to do this, and then sure enough, I'll look over and they figured out a one-armed way to do it. I
Master
think,
compensators.
wow. Yes, master
And
compensators.
so, what are some ways that you counter that? I know what I've thought of and considered at times are really large objects that
Yeah,
you can't squeeze between your knees or you can't manage, or
yeah,
perhaps the shape or the weight or the management of it is really awkward and they have to call upon both sides to participate.
yeah. I think you're right. I mean, I think the man who I've been referring to is really high functioning. He also works out. Was somebody who worked out all the time, and he has a one of those big gym balls at his house,
Right.
and that's something that you can't. I mean, you can palm it from underneath, but
It's
I ask him to
huge.
use two hands, and that gets really tricky.
Right.
And now he's even worked out how to palm it with his more involved hand, even though it's
Oh,
his
wow.
left hand.
Mm-hmm.
And then I complicate that. He has a weighted, what do you call those weighted balls?
Medicine
Okay, well, I'll
balls?
call it a weighted ball for lack of a
Sure.
better term. But anyway, so let's say he's got the big bulky ball balanced on his non-dominant, which is his more affected hand, and then I'll put something like a 5 pound smaller ball in his other hand. So he has these two disparate kinds of tasks going on at the same
Right.
time. So that really just makes it even harder. And then he's really multitasking, right? Because you can
True.
say, well, not really, because both hands are holding a ball, but it's so different when you are
Mm-hmm.
requiring someone to hold 5 pounds, where versus holding something that really he's just holding that great intrinsic plus kind of shape to keep balancing it on his arm,
Yeah, that's
on his
true.
hand. Yeah,
And your mention of multitasking, I even think during gait and walking as PTs, we've at times put patients' hands in their pockets
Yeah.
directionally, I think if we position items almost like neglect and inattention, if we position items to that non dominant side, perhaps they'll choose or have to use that. Perhaps it's, holding in my dominant hand my mobile phone while I'm texting and walking, and the other hand, the non dominant, is in a pocket or is holding on to something else that you have to retrieve the keys to unlock your door when you arrive at home.
Yeah, that's kind of what you were alluding to earlier, right? You
Right.
sort of occupy one to inspire the other to move. Yeah, so, I think for other therapists who might be joining us on the call, I guess what we're saying is uh, fighting a patient's hand dominance is a big challenge. Um, so you've got to think about how to make hand dominance a blessing instead of a curse, and still get both hands. I mean, both hands still look pretty the same because even though I'm very right-handed, I can do a lot of things with my left hand if I have to that I do with my right hand. And I think that's the thing to hold on to is that before the stroke happens, most people have a dominant hand, but they also have a pretty evenly matched
True.
partner that's the non-dominant hand. So that's what I would say about that.
So I guess when dominance is taking control of your recovery, as therapists, we have to make the dominant choice the affected hand so that it always has an opportunity to recover.
That's right.
Great talking, TK.
See you next week.
So,
No, 2 weeks.
2 weeks
What's
from
that date?
now.
Today
That would
is
be
the
the.
11th. That would be the 25th.
I'll see you then.
July 25 it is. Bye.
Have a good night.
You too.